So as I said, this is our 9th online event. So I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who has supported BookTalk as we've moved online in this very strange year. So I think we'll make a start now. We have 98 people here. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and welcome to this exciting event on Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This is our summer special event, I think we're calling it, and it's the last virtual event of this academic year. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm so excited to hear about the takes on this fantastic, timeless novel. So I'm going to hand over now to our host for the night, which is Cardiff University's own Jess Cotton. So Dr. Jess Cotton is a lecturer in the School of English Communication and Philosophy at Cardiff University. She specialises in 20th century American literature with a particular focus on poetry after 1945, psychoanalysis, feminism, and the history of the emotions. Jess will introduce the novel, give her own talk, and then introduce our other 2 speakers for this evening. And remember, yes, after the talks, there will be a Q&A, so do come up with your own questions. I'll hand over to Jess now. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm delighted to be here and to be joined by such wonderful speakers. I'm going to share my screen now with you. So I will introduce the speakers before their talks, but I'm just going to give my own introductory talk, which is related to a kind of project that I'm working on loneliness. Now, I'm sure you'll all agree that we've had somewhat of a lonely year, and certainly one way that I feel like that I've managed the past year is through reading. Now, I'm particularly interested in To the Lighthouse as a lonely book, as a book that helps us kind of think about the work of loneliness, particularly in relation to the work of reading. And whether you're familiar with Woolf's work or coming to the Lighthouse for the first time, I'm sure you'll agree that there's something really kind of unique about Woolf's writing, that there's something that really allows us to go deep into our own emotions. Now, this is often explained in terms of the literary technique, stream of consciousness, the ways in which Woolf switches between characters' inner worlds. And part of this kind of unique literary technique allows us to see the kind of the workings of the mind, all the kind of thought and the emotion that so often goes unrecorded and unspoken of. So I'm interested in here in thinking about loneliness as a literary technique that emerges from listening more acutely to characters as they listen to themselves and struggle to be heard. We become aware of how much is thought and felt and how little is expressed in the world. So I think that there's a deep loneliness at the heart of this book, which is also related to the work of Mourning, about what it means to experience the absence of persons, as we've been experiencing this year in the face of the pandemic and the failure of national mourning, and of one person in particular, the maternal figure at the novel's heart, Mrs. Ramsay. This novel, unlike the novel that Woolf wrote just before To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Dalloway, which takes place over one day, takes place over 10 years. And time is really important to this novel, as our speaker, Jane Goldman, I believe, will be exploring in more detail. And I think what's really interesting is that we get to experience, reading Woolf's work, the intensity of time, its subjective experience. And time is acutely tense when one is lonely. One has a sense of time expanding inexorably, of time standing still. It is, so to speak, dead time. Now, To the Lighthouse gives us a journey of sorts, but a journey that is not so much a forward progress as a slow and steady return to confronting the past, to confronting the values of aloneness that operate at the heart of the Victorian family, which stands in for the Victorian community as a whole. From the very first page, we learn from the perspective of a child, James Ramsay, of the violence involved in a commitment to upholding Victorian values. Mr. Ramsay values progress, order, and emotional restraint, the values that we've seen this government also clings to remorselessly. Now, James wants to go to the lighthouse, and his father says no, or rather, but. And it is this but which releases a frenzy of hatred in the young boy's mind. The bountiful nature of life that he feels in his mother's presence, the sense of community that he feels with her, is suddenly curtailed by his father's strict sense of the boundaries of the world, of the language of restraint and refusal. And this book takes place in an upper middle class family house in the Outer Hebrides, which is based on Woolf's own family home in St. Ives, which her upbringing as part of the Stephens family, and her father, Leslie Stephens, was a well-known Victorian writer. What Woolf allows us to see, as in an X-ray photograph, as she writes, at this passage towards the end of the first section of the novel, The Window, in this novel that's really kind of drawing on the new technologies of sight that were emerging at the beginning of the 20th century, is our characters' inner lives. So I'm going to read this passage to you here. Lily Briscoe knew all that. Sitting opposite him, and she's speaking here of Charles Tansley, could she not see as an X-ray photograph the ribs and thigh bones of the young man's desire to impress himself lying dark in the midst of his flesh, that thin mist which convention has laid over his burning desire to break into conversation? But, she thought, screwing up her Chinese eyes and remembering how he sneered at women, can't paint, can't write. Why should I help him to relieve himself? So Lily Briscoe wants to be left alone, uninterrupted, to escape this demand on her, the very demands that she sees that people place on Mrs. Ramsay. Loneliness is then a way of making space for creativity and also refuting the values of female emotion that prop up male egos. There is a code of behavior, she knew, Woolf continues, whose 7th article, it may be, says that on occasions of this sort, it behooves a woman, whatever her own occupation may be, to go to the help of the young man opposite, so that he may expose and relieve the thigh bones, the ribs of his vanity, of his urgent desire to assert himself, as indeed it is their duty. She reflects in her old maidenly fairness to help us. Suppose the tube were to burst into flames. Then, she thought, I should certainly expect Mr. Tansley to get me out. But how would it be, she thought, if neither of us did these things? So she sat there, smiling. In the refusal to do emotional work, Woolf sees the possibilities that are opened up to Lily and also to Mr. Tansley, though he is less self-aware, less aware of his own emotional investments. A few pages on, William Banks says what a relief it was to catch on to something of this sort when private life was disagreeable. He is speaking here about conversation. Conversation is shown as a distraction from the loneliness of privacy. In the absence of real conversation, the novel emerges to buffer an increasingly private way of living. All the characters into the lighthouse experience, indeed suffer from, a sense of loneliness, though that is by no means probably how they would describe it. So I think here that Woolf gives us a novel in which we're able to hear what loneliness sounds like, a loneliness that is made bearable by the possibility of having an interlocutor. The reader attends to characters' deepest thoughts, indeed to their deepest emotions, as the characters around them do not. So we might think here of us, the reader, as supplying that quality of listening, that emotional quotient that is missing in the novel. And I think often of loneliness as a failure of speech, a failure to communicate. And I think that reading provides us with a language to make space for this loneliness. It translates solitary thought so it becomes communicable. Woolf is writing during the modernist period, a period in which writers became acutely conscious of the difficulty of communicating in the modern world and of the sense of isolation that a technological and urban lifestyle imposes, a sentiment that has only intensified as life has been privatized and shifted into kind of the digital realm, where we are now. Reading Woolf brings us to the heart of the work that we do as readers of literature. Do we simply read to escape our loneliness, to relieve our lonely feelings? I want to propose that instead that we might think about the work of reading as a way to think about loneliness as connecting us to others, of a way to kind of explore and be creative with loneliness. That loneliness might not simply be isolating, but a source indeed of dialogue, indeed as it's brought us here to this kind of virtual community tonight. So that for all the anxious loneliness Woolf records, to the Lighthouse's vital lessons to tell us about community building. Indeed, that is often what the novel is invested in, even when, or especially when, community seems hardest to find. And the history of the novel in the 20th century, I think, is related and tries to find new forms and ways to think about the values of welfare and the limitations of the family to provide the vital answers that are needed to make people less lonely as people in a community begin to live emotionally and geographically further apart from each other. As To the Lighthouse progresses, the family begins to look gradually less rigid, and it thus gives more space for characters to express and work through their emotions. In her notes on the structure of the novel, Woolf writes how much more important divisions between people are than between countries. This is an idea that really goes to the heart of Woolf's politics. She doesn't literally mean that an individual's emotions are more important than, say, war or any other national event, but that we must start with these emotions to understand how countries end up at war and with each other. They end up at war precisely by failing to take emotions into account, by allowing hatred and loneliness to overspill, to find no creative and communal outlet. So I think we might think about this attention to a life of feeling in Woolf's work as a way of kind of letting more people into the space of the novel, and indeed to thinking about how we might think about a more kind of porous community. As Woolf writes in her polemic 3 Guineas, published just before World War II, in a rhetorical letter directed to a lawyer who asked her to donate a guinea to the pacifist cause, she says that we can best help you prevent war, not by repeating your words and following your methods, but by finding new words and creating new methods. To the Lighthouse is an experiment in form and style that shows what is at stake in finding new ways to explore a sense of Englishness, to imagine the community, the nation. What the novel gives us is a landscape in which we're able to see how the particular, multiple and contradictory I's that make up the national we that is wielded to make value, to make family values, and also to make war is an illusion of consensus that conceals many other lonely voices. So no we should ever be taken for granted, Woolf suggests. The I in Woolf, I think, is anything but solipsistic, though it can at times also be that. But it's also kind of crucial to holding that we to account. So who are the loneliest characters in the book? Mrs. Ramsay is peculiarly lonely in her role as a mother. Mr. Ramsay is lonely in his commitment to the violence of Victorian ideals. Charles Tansley is made lonely by social mobility. Lily is made lonely in her desire to be a female artist, to be burdened by men, or to refuse, rather, to be burdened by men. James is made lonely by the relinquishing of the maternal bond, the bond between mother and child, which psychoanalyst Melanie Klein writes about in her posthumously published essay on a sense of loneliness. A sense which she argues is rooted in the intense subjective bond between mother and child. By the sense of loneliness, she writes, I'm referring not to the objective situation of being deprived of external companionship. I'm referring to the inner sense of loneliness, the sense of being alone regardless of external circumstances, of feeling lonely even when among friends or receiving love. These anxieties exist in some measure in every individual, but excessively strong in illness. Therefore, loneliness is also part of illness. In her writer's diary, Woolf also kind of notes that her original motivation in writing to the Lighthouse had been to have her father's character done completely in it, and mother's and some eyes, and charge it, and all the usual things I try to put in it, life, death, etc. But the centre is father's character sitting in a boat reciting "We perished, each alone," while he crushes a dying mackerel. So I think that we might think of this novel both as an elegiac work, a way of asserting the importance of the work of mourning, but also as a riposte to Mr. Ramsay's acceptance of the individualism, the loneliness of death. We perished each alone, a line from William Cooper's poem, The Castaway, whose language of exploration is deeply rooted in the loneliness of the imperial mind. Against this commitment to individualism, to the isolation of privacy and imperial values, Woolf gives articulation to the power of maternal consciousness, to the maternal maintenance that holds the house, the lonely souls together when Mrs. Ramsay dies. This soul is Mrs. Nab, the working class woman who had been doing the invisible care work all along. To understand how the sense of loneliness arises, Klein writes, we have, as with other attitudes and emotions, to go back to early infancy and trace its influence on later stages of life. To the Lighthouse records what happens when a depressive feeling of an irretrievable loss is offset by a feeling that can be confronted. As we see as the novel reaches its end, the Lighthouse had become almost invisible, had melted away into a blue haze, and the effort of looking at it and the effort of thinking of him, landing him there, which both seem to be one and the same effort, had stretched her body, Lily's body, and mind to the utmost, as it has stretched our mind to the utmost. Ah, but she was relieved. Whatever she had wanted to give him, when he left her that morning, she had given him at last. So finally, Mr. Ramsay and the children sailed towards the Lighthouse. Left alone, Lily can return to her painting. As the boat continues to the Lighthouse, Lily goes on tunnelling her way into the past. For it's the past that holds what she's looking for. What does her painting look like? Woolf leaves this for us to imagine, but the work is done, the past is laid to rest, and a new sense of community pervades. Thank you very much. I will hand over now to Dr. Jane Goldman, who is Reader in English Literature at Glasgow University. She is the general editor of the Cambridge University Press edition of the writings of Virginia Woolf, and the author of The Feminist Aesthetics of Virginia Woolf, Modernism, Post-Impressionism, the Politics of Visual, the Cambridge Introduction to Virginia Woolf, With You in the Hebrides, Virginia Woolf and Scotland, Modernism, 1910 to 1945, and she's co-editor of Modernism, an Anthology of Sources and Documents. She's also editor of Woolf's To the Lighthouse and co-editor of Room One's Own for Cambridge, and she is currently writing a very exciting sounding book, Virginia Woolf and the Signifying Dog. Dr. Goldman also has a kind of wide interest in poetry and is a writer of poetry herself, and has a forthcoming exciting sounding book, Sex Excursions, which is coming out shortly by Dostoevsky Wannabe Press. I will hand over to Jane now. Thank you very much.
Hello, greetings from Edinburgh, and thank you, Jess, for that lovely introduction to me, but more importantly to the Lighthouse. Yeah, I'm going to talk about passing the time with To the Lighthouse, but I suppose I'm really going to talk about To the Lighthouse as a signifier. And I'm editing To the Lighthouse for Cambridge University Press, and I've been engaged with thinking about this text for more years than I care to think of now. But I would like to draw your attention to Virginia Woolf's first written conception of To the Lighthouse in her notebooks. And you too, as readers, can easily go and look at everything to do with the making of To the Lighthouse simply by going to this amazing website called Woolf online. So I'm going to share my screen now and show you this delight. Okay, so you should be able to see in front of me this little image from Woolf's notebook, where she conceives of To the Lighthouse as a visual image. I find this fascinating. She writes this image, and she says 2 blocks joined by a corridor. So today I'm inviting you to think about passing the time with To the Lighthouse by passing the time in this form. What does this form mean to you as a reader? And how was this initial concept actually played out in the material printed form of the book? What is it like for you as a reader to inhabit 2 blocks joined by a corridor? I don't have time to go into the statement above, all character, not a view of the world, except to say that Virginia Woolf famously doesn't believe in plots or character in the traditional sense in her writing. And here you're getting not underlined here, not a view of the world, which you might take to mean this is not a realist novel. I'm thinking this is about form to begin with. It's an exercise in form. The novel itself is coterminous with the second of 2 paintings made by Lily Briscoe, as you all know if you've read it. So it's a site of the making of a piece of visual art. But more than that, it is a kind of work of visual art. It's also, as Jess has been showing, the scene of lots of reading. It's not only that reading and writing and making are depicted in the novel, you as a reader are actively engaged in helping construct it. Virginia Woolf talked in a lovely essay, How to Read, about how the reader is the writer's fellow accomplice. So that's why I think To the Lighthouse is such a wonderful text to pass the time with, because it's all about passing time, but it's asking you to pass your time very carefully and with full focus on what's before you. So I think that means paying attention to the form of the words, but also to the form of the book. So those 2 blocks joined by a corridor, we can see here that we might think of the first one as the lighthouse, as the window. We might think of that connecting corridor there as time passes. And we might think of the third part there as the lighthouse. But we might also think, well, what is that a symbol of? It looks to me like a kind of slightly squat letter H. I began to wonder when I saw this, is it H for Hebrides? Since perversely, Virginia Woolf sets To the Lighthouse, if it is set anywhere other than in artistic print form, she sets it on the Isle of Skye. You have to read with close attention to realise that it's set in Scotland, but it definitely is. So is that an H for Hebrides, I wonder? Or is it, given that the novel is very interested in the letter I, particularly when spoken out of the mouths of men, is that an I on its side? Is that saying something about the way in which we write about the self? And that would take us back to that phrase, all character, wouldn't it? And we'd think, is all character being toppled here is I lying on its side. There are loads of other ways we could read that two blocks joined by a corridor, but we could also see it as a writerly mode. And of course, one of the great features of To the Lighthouse is Virginia Woolf's use of brackets. So are we seeing, could we see this as a kind of parentheses, that the two blocks that are joined by a corridor are a kind of big mega version of all those little very highly stylized usages of square brackets and round brackets in To the Lighthouse. So I'm going to take you through one of the things I've been doing to pass the time, which is to take apart the text in terms of its square brackets and its round brackets, and to examine the text that sits within the square brackets and the round brackets. Before I do that, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we also have an interesting question to ask. Which To the Lighthouse are you reading? This is something you can do. I'm sorry I can't see people online to see if you've got your copy in front of you. But if you were simply to turn to part 3 of Time Passes, which is the middle section of To the Lighthouse, and you look at what is the most crucial sentence in the whole book, some people would argue, the one in which Mrs. Ramsay dies, depending on which edition you've got, whether often people in America read a different sentence to those in Britain, but I've seen versions of the sentence in different locations. Consider these two versions of when Mrs. Ramsay dies in those square brackets. Mr. Ramsay, stumbling along a passage, stretched his arms out one dark morning. But Mrs. Ramsay, having died rather suddenly the night before he stretched his arms out, they remained empty. That's a rather stumbling set of two sentences. Notice how every time I read it, I get to the night before he stretched his arms out. And we see this break, but also this suture in the sentence where something suddenly prevents Mr. Ramsay from taking hold of his wife. She's already deceased. She died the night before. Suddenly, the night before, he stretched his arms out. So that beforeness, that sense of whether time has passed, time has gone back into the past, or is now recognizing a new present. There's no stable solution to the temporal rupture there. It's about mourning and loss, is it not? Virginia Woolf published To the Lighthouse simultaneously in America and in Britain on the same day, the 5th of May, which was the anniversary of her mother's death. So both versions come out. Here is a first edition. I'll just hold it up. This is a first edition, UK edition. I don't have a dust wrapper of To the Lighthouse. Look at its beautiful blue boards. And here is the American first edition. This is sadly not a real cover. It's a photocopy of a cover beneath which are green boards. So if I were to show you the differences, there are many other differences, but that's possibly the most shocking difference, that Woolf corrected the proofs for these two books separately, and they have a separate bifurcated life. So you might all just look and see whether the sentence in which Mrs. Ramsay is reported dying looks like the one I've just read you, or does it look like this one, which is in the American first edition? Mr. Ramsay, stumbling along a passage one dark morning, stretched his arms out. But Mrs. Ramsay, having died rather suddenly the night before, his arms, though stretched out, remained empty. Well, that's one sentence with several kind of parenthetical phrases in commas, but it's a different stretching of the arms. It's a different stretching of the syntax, and we're left. There is no correct version of those two versions, and now that we have the ability to see both at once, this is very exciting when it comes to thinking through what the different consequences are of each of those sentences. You could argue, well, Jane, what does it matter? The plot is saying he stretched his arms out and she wasn't there. You know, what difference does it make? She's still dead and she's still in that coffin. So is the two blocks joined by a corridor a kind of sarcophagus that is remembering the dead, some dreadful kind of Victorian memorial in which either way Mrs. Ramsay is interred in these really harsh brackets? Well, that's quite a gloomy reading of it. I'll move on to just say this is the kind of way I've been passing the time with the square brackets. I don't know whether you even noticed them to begin with, but the whole of the first section of To the Lighthouse has words in parentheses in round brackets occasionally, but there are no square brackets or editorial brackets at all. They're suddenly introduced in time passes. And I think it's really worthwhile paying attention to this. And there's a way in which you could argue that To the Lighthouse, you know, there's a secret tunnel through To the Lighthouse, through all the different kinds of brackets, so that when you're reading To the Lighthouse, you could be behaving a bit like Mrs. Bast and Mrs. McNabb, laying out the volumes of Walter Scott on the lawn, picking out the numbered fragments. I'll get to the significance of the numbered fragments in a minute, but think of it rather as like a kind of restored picture puzzle in which not all the pieces are there, and that Woolf has gone to the trouble of numbering those fragments so that there's a kind of mosaic in the first block, a mosaic in the middle corridor, and a mosaic in the final block. So I'll just scroll through what I've been doing here. Imagine, you know, that you, instead of reading all up To the Lighthouse, maybe you read it all through once or twice. Why not try reading it just through the square brackets? Interestingly, she only introduced those square brackets late on in the composition at proof stage, I think. So there's a way in which maybe the essential To the Lighthouse is occurring in these square brackets, these editorial brackets. And a question you could be asking, which you should be asking of the text, as Eric Auerbach would say, is who is speaking? Who is speaking, particularly in these square editorial brackets? Is this another voice? When is the action happening, and where is the action happening in these square brackets? So if I just scroll through, I've just extracted, you know, like a surgeon, all the things in square brackets in To the Lighthouse. It would be a very short novel. There you are, section 2, section 3, remembering that section 3 has this divergent parenthetical statement about Mrs. Ramsay's death. And then section 6 has all these other things about death. So everybody dies in square brackets. The first set of square brackets is Mr. Carmichael reading Virgil. which Virgil is he reading? Is he reading epic? Is he reading as in the Aeneid, or is he reading the Georgics, or is he reading the pastoral poetry? Which of Virgil is he reading? And depending on how you as a reader decide to answer that, that affects and colours the rest of the book. And then, so why is Mr. Carmichael reading Virgil on a par with Mr. Ramsay stumbling along a passage, and Prue Ramsay getting married, and Prue Ramsay dying in some illness connected with childbirth, and then poor old Andrew Ramsay exploding under a shell's explosion, being killed under a shell's explosion in the Great War, and then Mr. Carmichael bringing out a volume of poems. And then Lily Briscoe had her bag carried up to the house one late evening. Why are all those things within Time Passes given the same equivalence? Are they about a different kind of time, a different kind of place, a different kind of voice? And why are they given this equivalence? Then I've started to do, so the only other square brackets occur in the Lighthouse section. And here we've got this fantastic example that all of section 7 of To the Lighthouse part 3 is in these square editorial brackets. But look at that, within the square editorial brackets, we've got these parenthetical brackets, these round brackets. So you have this amazing sentence: McAllister's boy took one of the fish and cut a square out of its side to bait his hook with. The mutilated body, it was still alive, was thrown back into the sea. And then the final one is this longer section in section 10 of the third part. But I love that it was still alive, because that's like a tunnel within another tunnel, you know, a secret corridor within a secret corridor within the text. So recently, I mean, it's quite easy to do the square brackets and extract them from To the Lighthouse and set them out on our lawn like this. But it's more tedious and time consuming. But hey, you know, we've been in lockdown, so now is the moment. Here's my attempt to do just that. So I've been going through To the Lighthouse for all the parenthetical statements. And I think there's a reading one could do of just simply reading through those parenthetical statements. And that's one version of To the Lighthouse. What excites me is when you get to these parts where you get parenthetical statements within parenthetical statements, as in section 5 here. And again, if we go down a bit further, in section 14, all of section 14 of part 1 is in round brackets. Look at that. Look, it's a huge section. So, you know, that's all being, look at it, it goes on. And then it's got parentheses within parentheses. While we're here, this question of, we've been talking about it in terms of another time is being invoked in these parentheses, but also other places. And I just wanted to draw your attention to this, because one of the ways of passing the time with To the Lighthouse is to ask yourself, where is it set? Because when you do that, it resists the kind of realist readings that you might be tempted to make. So I just want to draw your attention to Andrew. Remember, this is in section 1, and he's a young person on the beach, and Paul and Minter are falling in love and about to announce their engagement. But Andrew goes off on the beach. Once on the beach, they separated. He going out onto the Pope's nose, taking his shoes off and rolling his socks in them, and letting that couple look after themselves. Nancy waded out to her own rocks and searched her own pools and let that couple look after themselves. Notice how there are these pools within pools then that seem to be Nancy's pools in the parentheses within parentheses. But I just simply want to ask you, where do you think the Pope's nose is? And when I attempted to answer that question, given that some people think Woolf isn't really setting to the lighthouse in the Hebrides, she really meant Cornwall, because that's where she spent her childhood holidays, in Cornwall. I prefer to take seriously the Scottish setting and to say there's a good reason to pay attention to the Scottish setting and all the Scottish names and the Walter Scott novel, etc., into the lighthouse. But when I asked myself, where is the Pope's nose, and then went to maps of Cornwall and maps of the Isle of Skye, I could find no such promontory called the Pope's nose. But I'll tell you now, I did find a promontory called the Pope's Nose, but it's actually in the terrain of the Battle of the Somme. And it's a famous promontory that was taken from the Germans by the Allies in a particularly bloody battle. And it was led actually by the writer Tolkien, and the soldiers involved were Northern Irish troops, and that's why they called this promontory that had been held by the Germans the Pope's Nose. So I know that Woolf knew about the Pope's Nose. She refers to it in her letters in the 1920s. It was reported in the Times. So that completely dislocates time and place here. This proleptic moment where Andrew, this young boy, in this parenthetical account of the beach sometime before the Great War, is now connected to what comes later in the novel. This other form of parenthesis here, a shell exploded, 20 or 30 young men were blown up in France, among them Andrew Ramsay, whose death mercifully was instantaneous. But I would put it to you that his death has already occurred for the attentive reader of To the Lighthouse, who bothers to think and follow up on where is the Pope's nose. I've no idea how long I've been talking for, but I'll stop now with just the invitation for you to think about numerology too in To the Lighthouse. It's very important to pay attention to numbers. For example, again, I'd love whoever's listening to now, if you've got a copy in front of you, just tell me how many sections you have in the third part of To the Lighthouse. You might want to put it in the chat. But I can tell you now that in my first UK edition, it is there are 19 subsections in the first part. There are 10 in the corridor, and there are 14 numbered. If you go to the end, you'll see the last number is 14 here in the lighthouse. However, if you look, there aren't 14 at all. There are only 13 because the text has misnumbered one. I think it's number 3 that's missing. So To the Lighthouse in the first UK edition has 13 sections misnumbered as 14. In the American edition, it has the final section is 13. Can you see that? So you may, depending on which copy text your paperback has come from, they'll have a different number. Why didn't Woolf correct that? Is she just some feckless, lazy writer Or is she playing games with us about sequences in a novel that's obsessed with linear thought and patriarchy? Mr. Ramsay thinking of his alphabetical mind going from A to Z and stumbling when he gets to R for his own name. Perhaps there's a reason why the numbers are not properly aligned. And also, if you think about it, 19 for the first part, 10 for the middle part, 14 for the final part. That lends itself, doesn't it, to the lapidary engraving you might have on a headstone, 1910 to 1914. Is Woolf playing games with us at this numerological level in the text? And I think the answer is yes. Yes, she is. So I urge you to pay attention to those bits of the text, those little bits of furniture, the punctuation, the spacing, the brackets, the shape of the thing, and go away and play with it. But also be very careful, because whenever you read a sentence by Virginia Woolf, it is reading you. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that fascinating paper, Jane. And I think, you know, those square brackets, I mean, it's hard to find a better kind of representation of death and the kind of the complexity, the work of paying attention than Woolf. I'm delighted to hand over now to Professor Elizabeth Elker, whose research focuses on late 19th and early 20th century literature and culture. Her latest book, Viral Modernism, The Influenza Pandemic and Interwar Literature, which is published by Columbia University Press in 2019, and which won the Samler Book Prize, which is the Southern Atlantic Modern Language Association, investigates how one of the deadliest plagues in history, the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic, silently reshaped the modernist era, infusing everything from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, the emergence of viral zombies, to the popularity of sciences. She is a recipient of numerous awards and grants, including a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Humanities. She has written on topics ranging from consumer culture to post-colonial representations of trauma to disability studies. Her first book, Consuming Traditions, examines the marketing of authenticity in 10th century Britain. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'll hand over to
you. Thank you so much, Jess, and for your remarks, and to Jane's. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, I'll also be talking on time passes, and I think that Jane's remarks and my remarks will go together nicely. So, in her 1925 essay on being ill, Virginia Woolf muses on how illness affects perception, how after an attack of influenza, the world had changed its shape. As I thought about what I might say to you all on To the Lighthouse in 15 minutes, I kept returning to our own experiences over the last 15 plus months about how our worlds, ourselves, our families, our communities, our nations have changed shape over and over as we navigate through this moment. In the US and the UK, there's a tentative sense, at least for now, of entering a new stage, of perhaps having time to start asking, as Lily Briscoe does, what does it mean? Then what can it all mean? And beginning to process the fear, the anger, and the enormous losses of this pandemic. And of course, in many, many other places, this sense of ending remains far away. Many of us feel broken in some ways, untethered from familiar structures and unmoored from time. The world has changed its shape, but the contours of that shape remain unclear. When Woolf wrote to the Lighthouse, she had already survived her own encounter with a deadly pandemic. Indeed, the deadliest outbreak of the 20th century, and arguably any century, was the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. Coming right on the heels of World War I, the virus that caused the second mass death event of the century infected 500 million people and killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, 5 to 10 times as many as World War I. In the United States, the US loses more people in the pandemic than it did in all of the 20th and 21st century wars combined. Woolf herself was likely stricken with the pandemic strain of the virus in 1919, a strain that damaged her heart, a common side effect, and when one echoed in her own character, Clarissa Dalloway, whose heart has been affected by her encounter with influenza. The experiences of the pandemic are woven into To the Lighthouse as well, specifically the famous Time Passes section that we've been talking about, which is structured around imagery of a domestic space invaded by air, darkness, wind, and nothingness. Imagery that speaks to larger questions of loss and grief, to the mass casualties of the war, but poignantly to the much broader experience of pandemic illness and what it means when an invisible, contagious threat moves through the air. In my recent book, Viral Modernism, I read Time Passes through this pandemic lens, tracing the imagery to the vast but neglected tragedy of the pandemic, which has both then and now been overshadowed by the war. That reading is too long for the time I have, and it seems more important this afternoon to reflect on what Time Passes might say to us about the pandemic moment we are all living in and struggling to understand. So I'm going to take us through a handful of passages from the Time Passes section that might offer us a map of our own moment, encompassing grief, bewilderment, a search for meaning, and a tentative recovery, maybe. The passages may grant the often profound recognition that literature and art more generally can offer us in adversity. Woolf takes the emotions, the bodily sensations, the losses, and the anxiety of a pandemic moment, and in that astonishing aesthetic alchemy, translates them into language. I'll start with a sense of loss and mourning. Time Passes is a prose poem on mortality and meaning. The language is saturated in grief. The very air of the domestic space is marked by loss. Woolf shapes an aesthetics of ineffability built from images of absence, silence, emptiness, darkness, and nothingness. Consider this representative passage. So with the house empty and the doors locked and the mattresses rolled around, those stray airs blustered in, brushed bare boards, nibbled and fanned, met nothing in bedroom or drawing room that wholly resisted them. What people had shed and left, a pair of shoes, a shooting cap, some faded skirts and coats and wardrobes. Those alone kept the human shape, and in the emptiness indicated how once they were filled and animated, how once hands were busy with hooks and buttons, how once the looking glass had held a face, had held a world hollowed out in which a figure turned, a hand flashed, the door opened. So first, here and elsewhere, we have the sense of ominous air, the literal medium through which contagion so often spreads. The air sneaks through small spaces, invading the indoors and introducing an invisible, omnipresent threat. The air, both necessary ally and pathogenically loaded enemy. At the same time, the passage grants form to loss and emptiness, making linguistically tangible the ineffable quality of the viral threat, creating a structure for what has no structure, and finding ways to grant form to loss and grief, which by definition are made of emptiness, by what is not there. This form is supplemented through constant images here and in other passages of emptiness, of jugs, urns, beds, rooms, houses, and more poignantly here, the clothes that in their emptiness indicated how once they were filled and animated. Anyone who has ever had to confront the clothes and objects of a loved one who is lost, and the strange animation, disanimation of those items, knows what Woolf is saying here. And in times of mass death, the kind pandemics bring, such losses and objects are everywhere, scattered across domestic landscapes and our own interior visions. Such grief and loss and their ineffability may in turn create a sense of vertigo, a word I keep returning to in this period, and a search often frantic for meaning, for something to hold on to amid the uncertainty. Woolf returns repeatedly in time passage to the image of the insomniac searcher who wanders from bed at night in hopes of answers. Should any sleeper, fancying that he might find on the beach an answer to his doubts, a sharer of his solitude, throw off his bedclothes and go down by himself to walk on the sand, no image with semblance of serving and divine promptitude come readily to hand, bringing the night to order and making the world reflect the compass of the soul. The hand dwindles in his hand, the voice bellows in his ear. Almost it would appear that it is useless in such confusion to ask the night those questions as to what and why and wherefore, which tempt the sleeper from his bed to seek an answer. In Woolf's time, the war had already challenged so many structures of meaning, the nature of death, ideas of divine promptitude or the compass of the soul, a belief in an affinity between the natural world and human endeavor. But illness, and in particular pandemic illness, offers even less structure, a death enfolded in such confusion that it can indeed seem useless to ask what and why and wherefore. The hand dwindles, the voice bellows, but no framework for understanding this loss arises. What Woolf captures, though, is the restless search for understanding anyway, the agony of the desire to find some kind of stability and meaning amidst the loss. It was impossible to resist the strange intimation which every gull, flower, tree, man, and woman, and the earth itself seemed to declare, but if questioned at once to withdraw, that good triumphs, happiness prevails, order rules, or to resist the extraordinary stimulus to range hither and thither in search of some absolute good, some crystal of intensity, remote from the known pleasures and familiar virtues, something alien to the process of domestic life, single, hard, bright, like a diamond in the sand, which would render the possessor secure. Woolf offers us here not the diamond in the sand that renders us secure, but a passage that encapsulates that very search and that franticness that descends, often at night, as we try to piece together what it all might mean in the face of so much loss. From grief and searching, Woolf moves at the end of the section to the strange process of emerging after a time of great trauma, as the past, with all its memories and losses, becomes a palimpsestic double to the present moment. At last, in the evening, one after another, the sounds die out and the harmony falters and silence falls. With the sunset, sharpness was lost, and like mist rising, quiet rose, quiet spread, the wind settled. Loosely the world shook itself down to sleep, darkly here without a light to it, save what came green suffused through leaves or pale on the white flowers in the bed by the window. The passage moves from the present to the past tense, as if the reader is watching the tragedies of the section move out of view. And yet the language suggests the way trauma remains just under the surface, even when unspoken or pushed away. Something ominous lurks, the sounds dying, the harmony faltering, the silence falling, the world shaken to sleep, and the darkness without light, except what falls on a seemingly empty bed. Surrounding all these grim images is a contagious quietness that rose and spread, with the darkness and the mist providing, almost, additional cover. The language captures the influenza pandemic's disappearance from cultural memory, but also a post-traumatic moment more generally. The memory quieted, obscured, shaken into sleep, yet infusing every sentence. The temptation is to forget, but in the section's final lines, Lily Briscoe jolts out of this acquiescence, bolting upright from a nightmare about falling off a cliff. Woolf offers a sudden return of the memory and a warning against forgetting. She ends with a single word sentence that functions as a way to describe Lily's state, as a plea or prayer for resurrection, however hopeless, and as an imperative declaration to the reader, awake. So rather than end on that more dispiriting note, I travel here briefly at the end of my remarks to the final section of the novel, where Woolf ponders the old question. What is the meaning of life? That was all, a simple question, one that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one, this, that, and the other. Herself and Charles Tansley and the breaking wave. Mrs. Ramsay bringing them all together. Mrs. Ramsay saying, life stands still here. Mrs. Ramsay making of the moment something permanent, as in another sphere, Lily herself tried to make of the moment something permanent. So here is what comfort Woolf and literature more generally might offer us in this pandemic moment, in the wake of all that has happened and all that might still happen. Time passes, and art and observation might make of it something permanent, might help us as the world changes its shape. Indeed, they might help us do some of that shaping. And note the imperative phrase. Mrs. Ramsay does not say, life stands still here, but life stands still here. It's a command, an action, a demand of life. A match struck unexpectedly in the dark. We need such moments in the days and months ahead. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that wonderful paper. I'm going to invite everyone to post any comments in the chat, and for our speakers to be joined in conversation now. So Jane, if you would also kind of like to join us. And as we've had, I will kind of open with my own kind of joint question to you, which is, since that you both gave these very rich papers on time passes, I kind of wanted to hear slightly more about this kind of the temporal kind of order of time passes. Of course, the first section opens in, well, we must wait for the future to show. And it's almost like, I think when I returned to it, reading it the last time, and that's probably with a slightly more kind of ecological consciousness, perhaps, than I had previously, of this kind of strange otherworldliness, this real sense of, you know, a kind of apocalyptic time of kind of looking back. And so there is almost that kind of note of hope that it's kind of written from this point after destruction, but also it seems really kind of way in the future, and from that kind of really kind of future moment to be able to kind of get a sense on the past, on how time passes. It's more of a kind of comment than a statement.
So I've been thinking a lot about that myself, and especially in relationship to our own pandemic. I think one of the most frequent observations that we all make is how weird time has become, right? How strange, how it stops and it starts and it jumps and it leaps and it's fuzzy and it goes too fast and it goes too slow. And I feel like in Time Passes that she encompasses all of those temporal modes in a way that reflects sort of traumatic experience in the war and in the pandemic and just more generally. And I started to think about, as I was preparing for this, the way passes, the word passes is both verb and noun and has so many different meanings, you know, to go along, to go around, to change a state, to go beyond limits, or to end, or to use up, or beautifully a route through, right? If we go back to Jane's sort of tunnel metaphor, you know, or a time as a passage, right, and a passes, right, as over a mountain, right, and I think she gets all of that in there.
Yeah, that's lovely, Elizabeth. I agree. I think I think the text is written in this very hospitable way, in that it's hosting for the future reader, and it's very Whitmanian in that sense, that the speaker of in Whitman, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, for example, is addressing readers of the future, people not yet born. And there's a sense in which Woolf really does have that apocalyptic but not horrific opening to the future, a text that knows it will be read and indeed will be edited long after the author is dead. So that of course it's hospitable to whatever our current predicament is. But it's also worth paying attention to the minutiae of the text, in which clearly it is signaling to particular historical moments. And the amazing thing about Time Passes is that, of course, Time Passes came out as a publication prior to the rest of To the Lighthouse. Time Passes was written during the general strike. And if you look carefully at the rhetoric about Jove smoting the corn and all this stuff and the thunderous rain, there's a kind of pastoral imagery there that locks onto a discourse about labor. And Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf supported the general strike of 1926, which in itself was an intervention by war veterans, by people who'd survived the war and seen their comrades die in the trenches, for a material world they were promised and that was never delivered. So I think the reader is always shuttling between trying to read and recuperate the kind of triggers in the text that speak to particular eras. The time in which it's supposed to be covering is ruptured, because it's both about time passing and the Great War. It's also speaking to that 1926 period when it was coming into being. And then, of course, the text itself goes through these new processes. It gets translated into French by Charles Moran and published in French. And then it's only recently that English language typescript became available to readers again, the typescript that was sent to Moran by Woolf to translate. So there's a kind of time of the book as well. There's a rupture in that. I'm not very good at French, but I've been looking with a French scholar, Kath Swarbrick, at the French translation as a stage in the composition of To the Lighthouse. And I've been looking at the way in which Woolf changes the composition of Time Passes as a result of seeing what Moran did with her first draft in French. So yeah, time passes, time layers, time admits that there are kind of opacities and gaps and spaces, but it's full of kind of, it's like bombs going off that suddenly, you land in a sentence and it explodes with several times at once in that way. But I loved your reading, because in a way, the only reading that counts is the one that we're doing now in the world that we're inhabiting now. I don't know whether that's helped, Jess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking of that, I think it's great to draw it back to the general strike, and perhaps, the general strike is actually what's needed to do the work of mourning, that kind of that space. We've got a few questions. The first one is, how do you interpret Lily's "I have had my vision" in light of what you're saying? So by the questions from Susan Westgrow, I assume that's, that question is related to Elizabeth paper, since you were speaking that last.
Well, so, I think that I would put this together with what Jess was saying and what Jane was saying, the kind of connections that are possible as sort of a hospitable reading, that what Lily's vision speaks to a range of different things that the reader might bring, right? That Lily herself brought, but it is left, you know, the painting is left sort of undescribed, except for this line right in the center. But what does that even mean? So I don't read that line as specifically linked to either the influenza pandemic or to our pandemic, but to a kind of general statement on the kind of, to go back to Jane's word, the kind of hospitable readings that that Woolf invites in her book, right? Inviting her readers in to see these very, very specific historical links and contexts at the same time that they're seeing the broad applications of these various emotions and bodies that are present throughout the novel.
We've got another question from Harry Lewis, what do you make of the title? Is it a journey or letter to the lighthouse? And what do you make of the lighthouse itself as a character? I don't know. I'd like to take that one up.
Well, I've done, you know, I'm in this weird position of supplying explanatory notes to an edition of Woolf. So I've got a huge note on To the Lighthouse. Of course, once I started arguing that we should take the Scottish setting seriously, I have had people sort of saying, well, Jane, point to the lighthouse in the sky that we should be thinking of. If it's not Godrevy Lighthouse that Virginia Woolf, we know, went to when she was a little girl, if it's not that, which lighthouse is it? Well, of course, you know, as she famously said in a letter, I meant nothing by the lighthouse. It's a kind of symbol on which, you know, readers can accrue their own meanings. Nevertheless, I think it is worth the candle to think through the kinds of readings of what that lighthouse is. And it's hospitable to many interpretations. But one that fascinates me, and I think gets some way, I agree, obviously, the key words are to and the as much as lighthouse. The is a bit worrying. As Tom Leonard would say, a dictionary of an English language sounds so much more democratic, but to the lighthouse sounds a bit ominous. What's nice in that sentence is, in that clause, is to the process. But I do think she was also reading Pharos and Familial by E.M. Forster, with, you know, because E.M. Forster served in Egypt in the medical corps during the war, and he wrote this great collection of essays called Pharos and Familial lighthouses. So there is the kind of lighthouse of Alexandria that sits above the lost library. So I think that's a lovely way to think about To the Lighthouse, you know, that it's a philosophical novel about journeying to an archive or to knowledge and the impossibility of that. Woolf was a great believer in the process of reading, the process of thinking, the process of finding out, but not necessarily too bothered about arriving at some final thing. What do you think, Jess?
What do I think that the lighthouse as a character? Yes, I mean, I feel like, you know, Woolf is being slightly slippery when she's saying, I meant nothing by the lighthouse. I mean, of course, I think of Vanessa Bell's painting, and I feel that it has some kind of personal significance. But I feel that Woolf does something very interesting, the symbolism. The symbol is both kind of, in the same way that maybe Gertrude Stein does, that the symbol can be kind of so overpacked that the actual meaning kind of unravels, like the rose is a rose is a rose, the lighthouse is a lighthouse is a lighthouse, until it can become something entirely new. And in a way, I think that the whole kind of book is this lighthouse. It's it starts off being the symbol, and by the end of it, it's become something that's reached and something that's no longer the symbol. So I suppose maybe the book is about the unraveling of what that symbol might mean, potentially.
I think that's a lovely way to think about it, breaching the totality of any symbol or metaphor. It's about it's a kind of act of vandalism on that sense of a secure symbolic order. I mean, it's also very sinister as a character. If you think of it as a character, then poor old Mrs. Ramsay sitting there, suddenly finding herself, hypnotically knitting, and the lighthouse strokes are coming round, and suddenly she says, "We're all in the hands of the Lord," and then she thinks, "Where did that come from? Where did that thought come from?" It's patriarchy. It's right in, she's internalizing it, right there in front of you. And it seems to be that the rhythm of the lighthouse is helping her to knit this rather sinister thought into her brain. But I love it. I think that's why I do love it, is because it's so technically precise, this novel, and hospitable to those kind of readings, but it doesn't mean anything goes. I mean, I think the way in which she's giving you these little tutorials in reading and writing and making, you become very self-conscious about what meaning you're making as you're reading.
There was a question from Megan Smith on expanding on the themes of gender and sexuality, which I think, Jane, you have just done there. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else. And there's also go.
Oh, sorry. So I had just one thought on gender specifically, in that it came up a lot in my research and my writing on Time Passes, in that so as a modernist, I had always been taught that there's this enormous number of dead male bodies, right, by 1918, right, they're piled up everywhere from the war. But what happens in 1918 is when the flu pandemic comes in, suddenly it's the same age bracket, right, that is at the most risk of dying in the pandemic. Young, healthy young men and women. That's what this flu did, is killed them in extraordinarily high numbers. And so all of a sudden in 1918, you have the domestic space filling up with the bodies of young men, but also of young women, right? And this sudden gender shift, and there's ways you can take those brackets. If you look at the kind of death toll or the ratio of death brackets in Time Passes, it's somewhat surprising, right? It's a young mother, and it's Mrs. Ramsay, it's Prue, and it's Andrew, and of course Andrew is the death that we expect, along with the 20 or 30 others, and it's the other two that are so surprising, and I think she captures there this way that the pandemic shifts the calculus of danger from the front lines to the domestic space in 1918.
That's a lovely way of putting it, and yeah, that is true. That's one of the kind of equations, isn't it, with Prue's death in childbirth, or complications from. So there is a kind of openness to was it flu or whatever, if you wanted to be that specific. But that's kind of questions of gender. But sexuality, we really need to talk about how sexy To the Lighthouse is, and how queer it is, and all those moments where Lily Briscoe is drilling into the sand with her finger and thinking about Mrs. Ramsay, and these moments of kind of queer time, which are already happening, in the world in which To the Lighthouse is being written. I mean, one of the things she says when she's stuck in London, she writes to Vita Sackville-West and says, "How I wish I could be with you, but I'm stuck in the Hebrides. Tonight, I wish I could be with you in the Hebrides." And the whole of the Hebrides is being taken up there as a smutty metaphor for sapphic love. And so, you know, that queer love is being expressed as much as it can be given censorship. I mean, it explodes in a way, doesn't it, in Orlando in 1928, which refers back to the Lighthouse and actually takes the piss out of it. There's a moment, isn't there, in Orlando where it says, "Here time passes," and it's in brackets and is really taking the piss out of To the Lighthouse in very interesting ways. But yeah, there's a queer time as well, isn't there? Which perhaps we're in some parts of the world, not every part of the world, we can acknowledge and access into the Lighthouse.
Yeah, and absolutely, the sexuality is so connected to the maternal in this novel.
Yeah.
I've got a practical question, which is, have your talks been published or made available online? So yeah, the extraction of bracketed materials, or Professor Elker's essay.
I just spoke off the top of my head, so
no.
and for me, the in the book Viral Modernism, I do a more sort of specific context-based reading of the pandemic of To the Lighthouse, but the book came out just as the virus was emerging. It's been really strange and eerie and weird timing on that. But so my remarks vis-a-vis the COVID pandemic were just for this.
This book here, the Cambridge Companion to the Lighthouse, a lot of the games that I was talking about numbering, etc., are in a little essay I wrote for this collection on form and style. So particularly about the counting. And it includes things like looking at the way the word yes is deployed across To the Lighthouse. Count that. The way Mrs. Ramsay so wants to say yes to her son and her husband, and it's Lily Briscoe who says no to Mr. Ramsay, and Lily Briscoe says yes to herself. So anyway, that if you did want to follow up on some of the things I've been saying, it's already been published in this essay.
Great. I know we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to give you the last few questions together, which is firstly, how can the bracketed sentences feel so cold or inhuman? The dreadful bracketed events are made strange and unfamiliar to us as humans. How could these events be understood when reading the form of the novel? A related question, I'm struck by the brevity of the narration of Prue's death and childbirth and of Andrew's death during the war. What do you think of Woolf's method with those events? And finally, how would the three panelists describe Virginia's literature in general if we take it as female accompaniment, support and empowerment? So in the last 3 minutes, I don't know if any of those questions kind of speak to you.
Oh, Diana, asking about that, about feeling human and inhuman, begs questions about our non-human companions and the companion species and the way in which animals co-shape everything, including composition. So I think talking about being inhuman is still within a kind of Cartesian philosophy where we want to divorce ourselves from the animal kingdom. And I think maybe those bracketed events are repellent in a way, but it's to do with how you encounter them. It's a very difficult question. Not all of them are cold though. I don't think all of them are cold. But that's a really good question. I'm sorry I can't answer it more specifically.
So to me, I think that anyone who's experienced a death, I mean, sometimes sometimes we know, right? Sometimes we know it's coming, but those brackets in their coldness, it sort of seemed to me to understand something about grief, about and our reaction to it, right? I mean, when we read those brackets, sometimes, you know, if for the first time you can be angry, you can be disbelieving, you can be shocked, you can be confused, you can be horrified, and all of these things are, of course, the stages of grief, right? That sort of shock of that could not possibly happen, right? That's not true. That seems so cold. That seems so random. That seems so wrong. And so sometimes I think that the coldness and the shock of it is a way of letting us see that experience again, because it's often like that, isn't it? The phone call, the telegram.
I would draw your attention to the one. Thank you, Elizabeth. I would draw your attention to the one which is McAllister's Boy, in which yes. Which is like a big kind of vivisection of a fish going on with the callous square brackets, but within this the round brackets, and simply those words, it was still alive. It was still alive, which is so optimistic. This idea of, well, maybe nothing dies. You know, there's a sense in which, and particularly because it's this fish, I find that a very optimistic moment within the square brackets, within this callous kind of patriarchal moment of a boy vivisecting a fish to catch another fish, that there's this tender embrace within that. Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? And yeah, I think that would map into your idea of elegy and the phases of mourning.
Yes, I mean, and I think that that's often what I love this optimistic reading. I love that. It also is just a sort of perfect picture of what grief is like, right? You're still alive, but part of you is missing and you have to go on swimming anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank our panelists so much for their brilliant talks, and to hand over to Anna Mercer, who will do the conclusion for me.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you so much, Jane and Elizabeth. I mean, 3 such really rich talks exploring Woolf and time and relevance today, and just so much more. Like, I could have kept listening to you for a good another hour or so, but thank you so much. It was so enjoyable to listen to your discussion. What a wonderful way to draw Cardiff Book Talk's first online season to a close. So thank you so much. To the audience, thank you for coming. Look out for news via our blog for the next season of events in 2021 to 2022. That's cardiffbooktalk.org, and you can also follow us on social media. But for now, please join me in a huge round of applause to thank Jess, Jane, and Elizabeth. And thank you to the audience for your great questions too. See you soon. Thank you and good night.